This series of sayings about the kingdom of God and an appropriate spirituality, attitude, way of living in relation to the kingdom of God occurs in the midst of a long speech. And Jesus is talking, in this instance, to us as disciples in the midst of a huge crowd. So there's this sense of his addressing us as a kind of in-group in the midst of this larger crowd. The theme that runs through these series of speeches that are loosely related to one another is the theme of readiness and being alert and of making decisions in relation to the coming of the kingdom of God. The first two episodes of this series, which begin, "Do not be afraid and make purses for yourselves that do not wear out," address the theme of greed that has been present in the earlier part of this series of sayings. So it is God's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions, give alms, make purses for yourselves that do not wear out. The second part of this, that is the last 3 episodes of these sayings, address the issue of watchfulness and faithfulness, and especially of being alert. That is, not being sleepy, lazy, not paying attention to what's happening in relation to the kingdom of God. So the metaphors that are present, which are in effect little parables. The first is, be like those who are waiting for their master to return from the wedding banquet. It's addressed to servants. And the second is about the owner of the house, that if the owner of the house had known of what hour the thief was coming, he wouldn't have let his house be broken in. So these are all parables that end with the injunction, you must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect, at an unexpected hour. Now, the mnemonic structure of these sayings is, first of all, do not be afraid, then sell and give as the framework for the first episode. Not afraid, sell your possessions, give alms. The second episode begins with purses. Make purses for yourselves that don't wear out, a treasure in heaven where thieves do not come near, no moth destroys. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So the verbal thread that runs through this is treasure, an unfailing treasure in heaven, and where your treasure is. The next episode begins with the command, be dressed for action, with your lamps lit. So the beginning of this then identifies the theme. Be ready for action. What follows then are examples of that. So, like those who are waiting for their master to return from the wedding banquet, and blessed are those slaves, those servants, whom the master finds alert. The next episode is also ends with, blessed are those servants. And then finally, the last episode is to know this, that if this owner of the house had known, so notice that verbal connection, know this, if he had known at what hour the thief was coming, he wouldn't have let his house be broken into. So you must be ready. So the frame of the beginning of this, be dressed for action, and the ending, you must be ready, the Son of Man is coming, is an inclusio that surrounds then these sayings about readiness. Now, there's a translation issue in relation to the NRSV. I have included in this the translation of the NRSV, which translates it as slaves. Blessed are those slaves whom the master comes, and so on. And slaves is not an inaccurate translation. It's probably the most accurate translation in terms of what it meant in the ancient world. That is, what Jesus is talking about are people who were in various ways slaves. But in the context of American history, slaves has connotations that are terrible. And it raises a whole set of issues that are inevitably in the background of hearing this, of Jesus, in effect, endorsing slavery, which was not the case. And while he didn't go on campaigns against slavery, he related to people who were servants and slaves, and they were included in the early church. And so it is not appropriate in our context, I think, to use that term. And so I would suggest that you translate this as slaves, as servants, and use that term throughout this section of Luke. What's going on in these sayings is, again, thinking back from the future, of the kingdom coming, and it is related to the primary prayer that Jesus teaches. Abba, your kingdom come. So it is a prayer and an anticipation that God's government in the world is coming. And the structure of Luke's story is that God's government in the world was established with Jesus' resurrection, so that we live now in the context of a world where God's government has been established. But it is not yet fully in power. And so for us to hear this as looking for the signs of the kingdom, for the signs of God's government in the world now, and to be ready to respond to those signs when we see them, and to act in cooperation with and in support of those things that are happening, that are signs of God's government in the world. That's what this is about. Now, one of those is in relation to money. What do we do with money in relation to God's government in the world? Jesus' recommendation is clear. Don't be afraid to give. First of all, it's God's good pleasure to give you the kingdom, so you give in response. Sell your possessions, give alms. Give to those who are poor. And by doing that, Jesus is effectively doing economic calculations. Build up for yourselves treasures, that is, capital, in the bank of God, in the bank of the government of God. To make purses for yourselves that don't wear out, to build up treasure, is to build up by giving, by not possessing lots of stuff, but rather of being ready to give, and thereby to build up an account, a bank account in the big bank. The second part of this addresses the question of readiness for the coming of the kingdom. And the reality is that most of us, most of the time, are not really ready. We're living as if the structures of the world, as we see it, as it is perceived, experienced, is the way things are. So, for example, in relation to warfare, violence, greed, the temptation is to be discouraged by those things, to be overwhelmed by them, to be lulled into the kind of passivity that comes from recognizing it looks like all these things are in control and there's nothing we can do about it. The reality that Jesus is announcing in this is that the government of God is present all the time. It's always active. The issue is to be ready to respond to the initiatives that are being generated by God's Spirit, and being ready now to act in relation to those things that you would see that would happen, whatever. Now, the metaphor that is used in Jesus' teaching here is to be awake like waiting servants. It appears that Jesus is describing what would have been the not infrequent thing in the houses, the big houses of Galilee. Somebody who owned a big house would have servants. So there's a big party. There's a wedding feast. The master of the house goes to the wedding feast. The doors of these houses were locked because they were constantly subject to thieves. And apparently, there was a pretty widespread problem of burglary and of thieves breaking in to homes. So the people who were in charge of the doors, the doorkeepers, would not even open the door unless they heard the voice of the master. Now, if they went to sleep and he came home at 2 o'clock in the morning and he's knocking on the door, he's stuck outside until they wake up and open the door. Apparently they didn't have keys, and so they were dependent on somebody opening the door. That's the metaphor that's in the background of this, is that experience of dependence on servants. Well, that meant that servants had to stay up sometimes all night because wedding feasts would go on until the early morning. So they'd have to stay up, and stay awake. Well, guess what? Problem was they'd go to sleep. So Jesus is using that metaphor to describe the way that we should be in relation to readiness for the kingdom of God. That is, to be alert all the time, like a servant who stays up waiting until the master comes home. It's not unlike what a lot of parents do when their kids go out on dates. They will try to go to sleep, maybe. But more often than not, they'll sit up and wait until the children are home, and they will let them in the door. So this is not unlike experiences that happen in families now. But a part of this is also clearly about the kingdom of God rather than about what happened in the homes of the big homes of Galilee. And that is, Jesus says that when the master finds them alert, when he comes 2, 3, 4 in the morning, he'll fasten his belt and have them sit down to eat, and he will come and serve them. Well, I'm willing to bet that that never happened in the homes of the Galilean aristocracy, that they'd come home at 3 or 4 in the morning, and so in appreciation for their servants, that they would have them sit down and then fix a meal and serve it to the servants. This is a metaphor for the kingdom of God. This is what God does. And God will respond by celebrating and serving those who are God's servants and who stay awake waiting. So this is a kind of promise about what will happen for those who are faithful and who stay awake, is that they will be rewarded by God serving them. And there's a way in which that's what we celebrate in the Eucharist, is that God lays out a feast for us. And just as Jesus did at the Last Supper, he has them sit down to eat and comes and serves them. So that's the metaphor. The last metaphor in this is about the owner of the house. If the master of the house knew at what time, at what hour the thief was coming, then he would not have let his house be broken into. But of course he didn't know, so he went to bed and went to sleep. The thief broke in the middle of the night. So the metaphor is, you must be ready because you don't know the hour when the Son of Man is coming. The Son of Man here is like a thief who comes in the night at an unexpected time. So Jesus uses these metaphors as a way of getting people's attention and identifying a spirit. So the energy that is present in this is not contemplative, but it's rather dramatic, and it has the spirit of these events. So in telling this, you want to capture that energy that energy of staying awake and of the servants opening the door and being ready for the master when he comes. Jesus' spirit in this is a spirit of a kind of delight at the role of servants and of these people coming home from parties and people waiting up for them. That's the spirit of readiness for the kingdom.